days, but we'll figure it out, inshallah. Days, but we'll figure. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Inshallah today. Sorry for being late, but we're gonna be doing this portion. We were at قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. We went in details with the word salati. By the way, I forgot to mention that the word salah itself, you can see in some ayat it's written as salawat or salat, and even though there's a waw, but many times that's actually not to be read. So why is it actually written? There are differences of opinions on why it was written. One of those opinions is that salat or salwat was actually a Semitic word that you would say in different Semitic languages. It actually means prayer as well. So the word salwata or salat, and the waw sometimes being omitted, that's actually a word that is in Semitic languages mean to actually mean prayer. But in Hebrew, it's mitbalil. The Hebrew, mitbalil. Taballul, I don't know. No, taballul is going to mean something else. I had to memorize that word because many times when I used to go to the Hebrew University and they would see me praying, they would come in, suspicious of what I'm doing. So I had to make sure that I know how to say that I'm praying. Okay, let's see. So in Hebrew, mitbalil is actually to pray. Okay, wa nusuki wa mahyaya. We went in nusuki, and nusuki, and we went in details with nusuki, and we said that some scholars gave the interpretation as a general comprehensive interpretation to mean any good worship or any type of a good action. So we're talking about piety, we're talking about a general comprehensive word to mean any action that one would do for the sake of getting closer to the Lord Almighty. So whether that could be perhaps picking up garbage off the street, or perhaps maybe taking a moment to just do 2 rak'ahs, that would actually be as nusuk. Other scholars, they made it more specific, and they considered that one, it means qiyamul layl. Others actually said salat al-Eid, and others actually said it is very specific and that it is only for slaughtering the biha. It is only for slaughtering the biha. In other words, during Eid, during Aqiqah, or perhaps during Umrah or Hajj. That's the only time that would be the nusuk. Okay. Mahyaya, and we talked about the difference between mahyaya and hayat, and we said this isn't necessarily talking about the life in general, but this is actually talking about the different corners in life, the different things that we would invest in, perhaps our energy in, or what skills, what we probably had, or whatever provisions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us that we would invest it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that would be mahyay. And mamati, whether after death, and I would prepare myself for basically the life after death. We're talking about grave, we're talking about resurrection, we're talking about Yawm al-Qiyamah, etc. So that would be within mamati. Or what would also be within mamati is that I would also invest after my death, such as writing a will, that it would be basically for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as instructed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a question, I think I answered it before, but I'm still going to answer it because I'm not really sure. And the question is, do we have to write a will before we sleep? And there are differences of opinions between scholars. I'll just make the story short. The first opinion, it is obligatory to write a will, even if you don't necessarily have loans that you probably owe, or anybody debt or anything, or you probably don't have that much money, or if you don't want to make a will, they still said you are obligated to make a will. So what kind of a will? Well, the will can be something like, please have taqwa, or make dua for me, or bury me as the sunnah, etc., for example. So the scholars that said that it's obligatory, they considered it as more than just a financial commitment or financial, at least, regulations in regarding to perhaps your finances, or perhaps a shahada you wanted to make or something like that, and they regarded it that this is a religious practice. They considered it a religious practice to prepare you every single day that this can be your last sleep and this can be your forever sleep, and that you will not wake up. So making it a ritual, making it a religious practice, a spiritual journey. So that's the first opinion. The second opinion said it was sunnah and only obligatory on the people that actually had some financial responsibilities or debts or loans to basically make up, and therefore they considered those people would be obligatory on them, but not necessarily obligatory as in general terms. Okay, so therefore they considered that generally, unless you had these responsibilities, but generally it would actually be a sunnah. So that was the second opinion. When you say sunnah, you're talking about extra credit if you are to do it. And opinion number three basically regarded as mustahab. That is as something that is liked, but not necessarily a sunnah that you have to do, and regarded that it would be sunnah on a person that had certain finances that other people did not necessarily know of, at least orally. Let's give an example. So let's say this man is married to this woman and he tells her, listen, now you know, and I had already written a piece of paper that is in the closet right there. You know, I own, let's say, Fulan X, I owe him this much, and Fulan, I owe him this much. But there's this hadith that said that we're not supposed to sleep إلا ووصيته مكتوبة عنده, except the wasiyah, except the will is written right next to them. So is this talking about specifically next to him, in, you know, just like under the pillow, for example? Or can there be just another paper that already put, it's in the closet, it's with the money, and it's basically notarized, everything's all fine, I've got everything under control, my wife knows about it. So for the scholars that said it was mustahab, they said what would be a sunnah, it in case that this person had some money to owe, etc. So they kind of went, you know, I guess a less degree than the previous ones. And they considered it would be mustahab to affirm or at least confirm what was already written. Okay, so it's kind of like more of a spiritual one, a spiritual practice that you would rewrite it, you would confirm the message that was already written, and more make it as right now it's relating to you recognizing that this can be your last night. So prepare to make a note to remind those that would be living after you to take care of such expenses. Okay, so that was Mahya Umati Lillah Rabbil Alameen. And we talked about the word Lillah, or the word Allah itself. We basically said, is it a conjugated word, or is it in itself actually going back to a word that is not necessarily conjugated? Okay, what's the difference, and why is that even a thing to say it's a conjugated word? Okay, so if you are to say it's a conjugated word, that means there's a verb to it. That's basically what it means. Because in Lugha Arabiya, a conjugated word goes back to either a three-rooted letter, or a four, or a five, and those would be rare ones. So usually it's going to be three. Okay, so if let's say we say ma'kul, the root is akala. If we say, for example, midrab, the root is daraba, and the list goes on. Okay, and then therefore the additions of in the word midrab, then the addition that is the meme is basically going to tell me that this is basically an ala, that this is to basically indicate that this is a tool used for the root daraba. Okay, and so on. Okay, now the same thing if we're talking about ilah is the root wa la ha, or a la aliha, or is it in itself aliha is not necessarily a root, meaning it is not a verb, but it is in itself considered jamid, meaning that it is not a root and it is a word that basically is a noun and does not have a root to relating to a verb. Okay, not many words are like that, but some words are like that. So just like when we were talking about the word qamar and shams, what is the root? There is no root. This is jamid. This is basically as is. This is the word that was perhaps Semitic word that basically is a noun for something and is not a verb for something, and therefore it is basically that. It doesn't have necessarily a root. And the scholars that said that, they said that the root is basically ilah or aliha, and that basically goes back to the root, that the one that is worshipped. So of course we said that that is the preponderant, and even if you were to talk about waliha, which is what you adore, what you consider as a center, we said that at the end it's basically what you worship. Okay, رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. But wait a minute, قل إنني هداني ربي. Did we actually finish that one? Hold on. Let's see. الكي الطبري is basically one of the Shafi'i scholars. أحكام القرآن. Okay, right there. Let's see. He said قل إنني هداني ربي إلى صراط مستقيم. Up. So here we go. الكي الطبري has something to say from here to here, to the point that our friend al-Tabari wanted to say something, and he said, of course, al-Tabari is Shafi'i, so let's see what quote he wanted to say. He said, استدل به الشافعي على افتتاح الصلاة بهذا الذكر فإن الله أمر نبيه بين حاصرتين به وأنزله في كتابه، ثم ذكر حديث علي أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان إذا افتتح الصلاة قال وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين etc. until وأنا أول المسلمين. Okay, what did al-Tabari actually want to say? He said, well, Shafi'i used this, so basically this ayah right there, or these ayats up until here, to basically say that it is basically part of what you're supposed to start your salah with. Why? He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered his prophet, and when you look at this bihi right there, that actually is indicating that this word bihi was not in all manuscripts, for at least of Tafseer al-Qurtubi. All right, and that it was revealed in the book, that is the Quran, and that he mentioned this hadith narrated upon Ali ibn Abi Talib. This hadith, you could see, is basically a hadith that has authentic resources. Let's see, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he was starting his salah, he would say وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض. So basically he would say وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين وما أنا من المشركين. Okay, and then he would read basically these parts of the ayat. Okay, so if the Prophet ﷺ had done that, as Ali ibn Abi Talib had mentioned, according to Shafi'i, then before you would even read the Fatiha, you would say Allahu Akbar, and then you would make this dua. وجهت وجهي الذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين وبذلك أمرت لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. Okay, that was Ali ibn Abi Talib's saying, and basically his witness that that's what the Prophet ﷺ had done. Shafi'i took it that that's basically part of what you have to do, making it obligatory. Well, is that necessarily the case with all the other scholars? Let's say furthermore. And of course, al-Qurtubi wanted to actually say, well, you know what? Thanks for the quote, Shafi'i, but guess what? We actually have, and especially that Malikis, they basically consider Imam Muslim or consider Sahih Muslim as more important than Sahih Bukhari. That's why he wanted to make a note of that. And he said that this is actually in Sahih Muslim, therefore it is highly authentic, and wanted to actually quote perhaps a different narration. And let's see what the narration says. That the Prophet ﷺ, إِذَا قَامَ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, if he were to do qiyam for salah, if you were to, does the word qiyam to mean during the night, or does the word qiyam meaning that he's standing for salah? Let's see. What does he say? وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين اللهم أنت الملك لا إله إلا أنت ربي وأنا عبدك ظلمت نفسي واعترفت بذنبي فاغفر لي ذنوبي جميعا إنه لا يغفر الذنوب إلا أنت واهدني لأحسن الأخلاق لا يهدي لأحسنها إلا أنت واصرف عني سيئها لا يصرف عني سيئها إلا أنت لبيك وسعديك والخير كله في يديك والشر ليس إليك تباركت وتعاليت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Beautiful hadith. What does it mean? It means I face my face. Is this talking about the face in itself? This is talking about the face and the most important area that contains one, whether we're speaking about intellect, your ability to recognize your most important tools. We're talking about your eyes. We're talking about your lips. We're talking about your nose. We're talking about your ears, that those are basically considered the most important areas of your senses. And we know that your skin is the biggest organ, but we're speaking about the senses that at least help you the most to relate with the world around you. So that's why it basically makes wajjahtu wajhiya to mean not necessarily just the face, but this is to include every single sense in my body. I would face it to the one that created the heavens and the earth as one that is worshiping one God Almighty. And I am not a part of the polytheists or the ones that would associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Verily, my prayer, my ritual, my life and every single effort in my life and my death and everything that I would invest towards my death is all for the sake of the Lord Almighty, the Lord of the worlds. There's no partner, a partner to associate with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I was ordered with that, and I am amongst the first Muslims. Oh Allahumma anta al-Malik. Oh Allah, you are the King. There is no God worthy of worship but you. You are my Lord, and I am your servant. I had transgressed upon myself, and I had confessed in my sin. For so, Lord Almighty, forgive all my sins, for you are the only one to forgive the sins. And guide me to the best of the manners, for no one will guide to the best of it but you. And keep away the worst of the manners, for no one is to keep the worst of the manners but you. I come to you in obedience. I come to you asking for your help and asking that you would be content. And all the good is in your hands, and the evil is not to be attributed to you, and no evil is to be submitted or given or be done to it in your cause. O Lord Almighty, you are Almighty, and you are the one that no one is like unto. I ask you to forgive me, and I repent to you. What a beautiful dua. Ameen. What a beautiful dua. So a couple things to say about this dua. So number one is that for basically the evidence that the Prophet ﷺ did actually stand to say this dua as even before the Fatiha. That's the first opinion. Let's say you could see the scholars debated whether one, let's look at those opinions. The first opinion basically said that it is something that the Prophet ﷺ had done. Therefore, is it obligatory? Is it a sunnah? Or is it just mustahab? Those were the three debates. Okay, obligatory, sunnah, or mustahab. And certainly there are the Hanafis that basically said this isn't part of salah, but this is something that you can do before salah. So before you would even say Allahu Akbar, you would say this before you even start. Okay, that was the first opinion for al-Hanafis. The Hanafis also had mentioned that this was something to be for Qiyam al-Layl and not necessarily for the 5 daily prayers. That was also another opinion considered Qama ila Salah, that this was specific for Qiyam al-Layl. And what is the evidence that they had used? Well, they said, listen, remember the Prophet ﷺ, he basically taught that man, and he said, إِذَا أَرَدْتَ أَن تُصَلِّي فَكَبِّرْ, and then basically instructed him to read the Fatiha. He said, well, look at right there, the Prophet ﷺ taught him that if you want to stand up for prayer, so basically just kabbir. And that's why he said right there, قُلْتُ لِأَبِي كَيْفَ تَقْرَأُ إِذَا افتتحت الصَّلَاةِ, what do you read if you basically attempt and start the prayer? And that he said, I said Allahu Akbar, and then Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. And that he did not mention that توجيها ولا تسبيحا. توجيها is وجهت وجهي الذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. Basically that's the توجيه. تسبيح, and it was basically سبحانك اللهم بحمدك وتبارك اسمك وتعالى جدك ولا إله غيرك. Okay, so he wanted to say that as the Hanafi madhab. They said, we've got our evidence that all of those du'as, that they don't necessarily have to be within the prayer, but they're actually outside of the prayer. Okay, that the real part of the prayer is going to be once you say Allahu Akbar and you head straight to Fatiha. Okay, all right, so a couple things to say about this. Right this one. And he also wanted to mention this portion of it. وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ, and also لَبَّيْكَ وَسَعْدَيْكَ. I know I translated, oh dear. Okay, I know I translated لَبَّيْكَ وَسَعْدَيْكَ. Let me just delete all of this to help you at least see where we're at. And where's that لَبَّيْكَ وَسَعْدَيْكَ? Here it is, okay? لَبَّيْكَ وَسَعْدَيْكَ. So when we say لبيك اللهم لبيك لبيك لا شريك لك لبيك إن الحمد والنعمة لك والملك لا شريك لك, when we say that during Hajj, what does it actually mean? So لبيك actually means that I am responding to your call, to your invitation, and I am not associating any partners with you and basically coming there. The other one is labbaika, to mean that I am submitting myself in coming at your service. Okay, that's the first one. Sa'daik, is it to mean that you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be content over you from his sa'ada, or is it you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you the help in case that you are coming, you have the will, but your body fails you? So what does that look like? I want to do Qiyam al-Layl, but then my ankles, my joints are basically sore. I would want to do it. I have the will. In fact, I stayed awake and I wanted to do it, but then my body is failing me. So that's that point. That's the first interpretation, that you're saying Sa'daik as Ya Allah, Sa'idni, help me to be able to be committed to your call, even when I had the will to want to do it, but then my body is basically failing on me. So you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you that support to keep you strong. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is that you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Sa'dak, that I am coming to submit to basically and respond to your call. So be content. Ya Allah, be content. Let me be content, and you also be content for the commitment that I had shown in my presence, in my response for your call for me to get closer to you. Okay, that's the second one. Now, what about this portion of it? وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ. So وَالشَّرُّ إِلَيْكَ, there were also two interpretations. The first one, الشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ, to mean that it is part of al-adab. It's part of the manners in relating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you are basically saying evil, even though you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, min sharri ma khalaq. There are some things that may contain evil, and they are part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, but from the adab that you would relate with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would never attribute that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is evil, even though some of the things may be really part of what, with your narrow vision, you would think, well, that actually means that this evil thing was created by Allah. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ taught us basically, وَشَرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ. Evil you never attribute it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Hakim, is al-Khabir, is basically the one that وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, that all the good names and all the good attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had permitted that we would make dua with, we would basically use that to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, even when things, let's say, a relative of mine, a dear person died, well, who basically terminated this person's life, well, we know the one that controls basically ajal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I feel so bad that this person that is so dear to me died, or probably got cancer or something. I feel so bad, but I'm not going to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused it as adab, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one technically that he basically was behind and is the one that controls, that he is al-muhyi and al-mumit. He's the one that basically brings life and brings death. He is the one that causes illness, and he is the one that causes, and it is the cause for cure as well. Not curing this person, or not us not finding the cure for this person, even though we probably had made the dua, we would never attribute that this evil is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation was actually made by Nadr ibn Shumayl. Just an idea about Nadr ibn Shumayl. Is basically a scholar in Lugha Arabiya. Wanted to actually just show you a little bit about him, but I decided, right now you guys are really tired, so I'll just basically skip that one really quick. He's actually available right there. And let me show you where it is in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, and there's another Ibn Shumayl. Okay, another Ibn Shumayl, basically you could see he was born around 122-year Hijriya, and that he was actually a scholar not only in Lugha Arabiya, but also a scholar in Quran and scholar in Sunnah as well, meaning Hadith. Okay, so this is just a little bit about him. So we're going to go back to this one. The most important thing that he was basically saying is that, number one, let's see, let's go back to it right there. Okay, that معنى قول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والشر ليس إليك، الشر ليس مما يتقرب به إليك. الشر ليس مما يتقرب به إليك. That evil is not something that we can somehow do and say that we are trying to get closer to you. In other words, only good things can be used as a way to get closer in spirituality, to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically what it means. وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ لَيْسَ مِمَّا يَتَقَرَّبُ بِهِ إِلَيْكَ. a second opinion. So the first opinion is that we would never attribute anything that is evil to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of adab, even though the ayah said min sharri ma khalaq, that we would seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the evils that He, from some of the evils, because that min is right there, tab'idiyya, min sharri ma khalaq. And the second opinion is that we do not use evil to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Evil can never be something that can get us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Let's see Imam Malik right there, since of course Al-Qurtubi is Maliki. Let's see. He said, ليس التوجيه في الصلاة بواجب على الناس والواجب عليهم التكبير. Well, here you could see Imam Malik, even though he's actually Shafi'i's sheikh. But generally, of course, the Malikis, they would consider to say, وَجَّهْتُ وَجْهِيَ الَّذِي فَطَرَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, etc. That tawjih, that's basically called a tawjih. So when you say at-tawjih, we're actually speaking about specifically about this dua that we had just basically done, whether in short, which basically is right here, of course, whether we're talking about the short version, which basically is this one, or whether we're speaking about the longer version, which basically would be with this one. Okay, well, at least right there. Okay, well, the other question is, let's say I didn't memorize it. Can I hold my phone and actually read it from my phone? According to some scholars, yes. Can I write it on a piece of paper and read it off a paper, read it off a book? The answer is some scholars actually said yes. So just letting you know. And the objection that other scholars had is that there's going to be involving too many movements. But of course, today, we don't need to necessarily move. Other scholars, they actually said our evidence is that you had to have memorized the hadith or the ayat or the du'as or the process of salah. So for Imam Malik, he basically said ليس التوجيه, that وجهت وجهي basically is called the tawjih, that it's not obligatory. I want you to look at this word, that it's not obligatory, but what is obligatory is basically at-takbir, is basically saying Allahu Akbar and then reciting al-qira'ah, meaning al-Fatiha right away. Okay. Ibn al-Qasim, his name is Abd al-Rahman ibn al-Qasim, he said, لم يرى مالك هذا الذي يقوله الناس قبل القراءة. He said, Imam Malik did not actually say that we are supposed to be reading that dua or reciting that dua before reciting al-Fatiha, or even saying سبحانك اللهم بحمدك وتبارك اسمك وتعالى جدك, of course, وفي المختصر. All right. تبارك اسمه وتعالى جدك ولا إله غيرك. And of course, when we say وفي مختصر ما ليس في المختصر. This المختصر is basically one of the Maliki books that Imam Malik used to say that this hadith is actually authentic, but you could see that some Malikis actually said he didn't want to practice it in public because he did not want people to think it was wajib. In other words, it was a practice that he himself had actually seen. Okay, Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi. What did he say? Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi, he said, كنت أصلي وراء شيخنا أبي بكر الدينوري الفقيه في زمان الصبا، فرآني مرة أفعل هذا فقال يا بني إن الفقهاء قد اختلفوا في وجوب قراءة الفاتحة خلف الإمام، ولم اختلفوا أن الافتتاح سنة، فاشتغل بالواجب ودع السنن. This is actually really important. But first of all, what does it mean and who is this person? Okay, let's see. He basically said, I used to pray behind my or our Shaykh, Abu Bakr al-Daynawari, basically, and that it was during the times when they were young, and this is important, praying behind a sheikh when during early age and during shabab, or during, when they were teenagers. I guess he was talking about teenage here. And then one time he saw him basically while praying, that he was basically saying subhanak Allahumma hamdik, etc. And then he said, oh, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on reading al-Fatiha, but they did not have differences of opinions to say subhanak Allahumma hamdik wa tabarak asmuk wa ta'ala jadduk wa la ilaha ghayruk, that's a sunnah. So therefore, he said, stick to what is wajib. What is wajib? What is wajib is basically reading, saying Allahu Akbar. And then, of course, they had differences of opinions on al-Fatiha, but sticking to that, wada' sunan, and leave all the different sunan, basically, such as Subhanakallahum bihamdik or wajjahtu wajhiya alladhi fatara samawati wal ard. But first of all, who is this al-Jawzi? Ready for stories? Let's go for al-Jawzi and actually learn about al-Jawzi, because we've got some things to actually learn about al-Jawzi. So I'm going to open it up for us right there. I'm going to show you exactly where we're going to be going with al-Jawzi right there, because we've got some things to work on. Let's see. We're going to do Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi, and we're going to take you to Aluka website. Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi and Aluka. I'm going to show it to you right there. I want you to see it because I want you to see those websites, okay? Now, you could see right there, very important website. This is actually a really good website, very well done. And let's see right there. So who's Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi? A very, very important figure. And you could see, love the way that they had described him. They said he was one of the scholars that are Rabbaniyin. What does the word Rabbani actually mean? The word Rabbani is actually a Quranic word to mean a person that is always connected and always committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a high level, okay? And that he actually faced a number of different predicaments, and they basically, they all know that, but of course, and some of those predicaments, some of those hardships were actually probably, each one is harder than the other. And certainly, what is the most important thing that he basically faced? And we're going to see that right now, inshallah. So number one is that he is a shaykh. He's basically shaykh to mean a teacher. Is also al-imam and al-allama. I want to look at the word al-allama because this is to basically mean that he had basically the ilm in various ulum, in various sciences. So you're talking about the science of tafseer, the science of fiqh, the science of hadith, the science of lugha arabiya, etc. So that's basically would be al-allama. Al-hafiz, that he had memorized basically 500,000 hadith and above, and al-mufassir, the one to basically be an expert in tafsir. And that, look at this one, shaykh صناعة الوعظ. This is probably what Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi is probably most notorious for, which is al-wa'z. But what is al-wa'z? Al-wa'z, in general, literally, it actually means to give a nice word, to give a kind word, to remember somebody to get basically on the straight path. Later on, it became basically a word specific to a specific job that one would hold. Remember the motivational speakers and basically the motivational speakers, but these motivational speakers that during the time of al-wa'z were basically the ones to motivate people to basically repent, to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to do istighfar, to connect and stay connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically al-wa'z. Okay, it became something that certain people basically had a better skill than others in being an influence on basically the people, to remind them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so forth. And that was one of the key things that Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi was an expert in, and a person that had perhaps surpassed all those that were doing an excellent job on that. And you had in Wa'z is not everybody's it's not necessarily something to just learn. It's also a combination of ilm and skill. Some people are just so good at doing wa'z that you could see, even though they might not have this magnificent ilm, but they know how to reach to people's hearts. They know how to get to people's hearts. They know how to really soften people's hearts, remind them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bring them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the most important people during our times, or at least he died some while back ago, and it was was actually Sheikh Kishk. Doesn't necessarily have the greatest ilm, but his influence was probably one of the biggest influences out there that he affected millions, and we're talking about millions and millions of people that had been influenced with his method to get people closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though he many times would use hadith that are not authentic, and his words are pretty simple. If you were to write down his words, you would actually see, I mean, these are simple sentences. It's not hard to say this, but his method in reaching out to people's hearts, you cannot but sense the khushu' in his words. You cannot but sense this faith in his words. Just when he says, Manil Malik, that second when he says that, and you just all of the sudden just feel your heart tremble just by his method of delivering that word of oration. Very influential person. And you know what? Maybe I could show you just perhaps maybe I can show you what he looked like. And Sheikh Kishk, let's see, right there. Okay. And certainly he was, oh, okay. Wrong address. Sheikh Kishk, okay. It wanted to give me Kushari, I guess. Here we go. Sheikh Kishk. This is him. Very, very influential figure. You could say he was actually blind, but very influential, and even had influenced many key figures just by his very simple lectures, but they were full in meaning. They were very full in meaning, and that's where, of course, you could see that il-wa'z is not about information. Il-wa'z is actually about that transparency, is about the heart speaking, and not necessarily the tongue. You can see people that they've got very, very eloquent speeches. Some people may have very eloquent speeches and great ilm, but when it comes to reaching to people's hearts, you would see that something is not clicking. And you would see people that probably don't have the ilm that this person has, and probably not the eloquence that this person has, but they would have in simple words and the open heart that they're actually capable of reaching out to people's hearts and having the influence onto their hearts and the influence onto their behaviors. And I want you to look at this one. He basically gave this tarif and he said Durrat al-Majalis. He was also the pearl of every setting. And he was a person that combined the sciences in various sciences. And he was also the one to have very many books that he was a title of. And this is basically his name, Jamaluddin. But remember, the word Jamaluddin is a nickname. The word Jamaluddin basically means that his name was Abdurrahman. And of course, when we say, for example, Ahmad, that would be Nuruddin or Shamsuddin. If we are to say, for example, Izzuddin, that means his name is Mas'ud. If we are to say Salahuddin, that would be Yusuf. If we were to say Muhammad, that would be Alauddin, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But that was a nickname at one point. Anyhow, let's see, Ibn al-Jawzi. And of course, you could see that Amir al-Mu'mineen, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, his ancestry goes back to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. When was he born? Well, he was born 510 Hijriya in Baghdad. Where's Baghdad? Well, it's basically in Iraq. And his father died when he was only 3 years old, letting him live as an orphan. But who takes care of him? Well, his aunt, paternal aunt, she was the one that took care of him because his mother got married. So he basically grew up as an orphan, and he would basically get trained by his own paternal relatives. And notice this, ladies, I want to look at this person. This person is a key figure. Who takes care of him? Why do I keep on saying maternal? Paternal aunt, his amma, basically takes care of him. And you want to keep in mind what she did. She basically she noticed that he was not excited, or that he was keeping away from anything that involved entertainment or anything that involved business. So she basically dedicated him to ilm. Look at that, ladies. Look at the influence. I want you to see the influence. She was a key figure. She was a key figure in making that dedication and seeing, you know what, I could see in him this ability that other people do not have. So she basically dedicated him for him, and she would be his mentor. So he stayed in the masjid and would listen to the lectures, and also the different lectures in different madhab as well. So you could say he was basically following Ibn Zaghwani for the madhab Hanbali, and certainly little by little, just by attending those lectures, those classes, he basically developed a skill in becoming one of those orators as well. So that's when, of course, he was competing with those that are within his age. And certainly, I want you to look at this one. وَكَانَ وَهُوَ صَبِيٌّ دَيِّنًا مَجْمُوعًا عَلَى نَفْسِهِ لَا يُخَالِطُ أَحَدًا وَلَا يُجَارِي أَتْرَابَهُ فِي لَهْوِهِمْ وَلَعِبِهِمْ. And what does that mean? He said he was basically, since his teenage, he was dayyinan. He was a religious boy, and he would combine himself. In other words, he would be to himself and would not associate a lot with people, and he would not even compete with the other kids his age in perhaps maybe in their entertainment, or in their playing. That wasn't his world. From his early times, he was a person of mission, of ambition, and he would always be a person that aimed high. And that basically motivated him to sit with Sheikh Zawani, and even be the teacher in basically in his place after he had died. Even though he was basically a young man, not even yet 20, but some actually said, well, too young, you're not supposed to be sitting there. And then, of course, he basically thought, okay, well, I'll just be a wa'adh. At least I'll just be the person to not necessarily teach as the madhab Hanbali per se, but what I'll do is that I'll basically work in doing wa'adh, because it doesn't require that much ilm, but I'll be able to at least deliver the message out there and bring people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the same time, it was actually something that was very common. People used to be doing it. I mean, because it didn't require a lot of ilm, so he would basically do that. But then, of course, he was standing out in his ability to do wa'adh that perhaps no one else was capable of competing with him, because everyone was deserting the other speakers and they would basically come to him. Why? Well, because he was very eloquent, he was very transparent, his words were very beautiful, and certainly he would give great metaphors, great figurative examples, and he would also dig deep in the different rich meanings, and certainly he would bring about those sentences, those examples that are very close to basically the understanding of the attendees and in simple terms without going into very hard basically jargons, and he would basically make it simple, and that was basically influencing people, and he was one of these people that no one was capable of competing with, and in fact people were joining in massive numbers, including al-Khulafat themselves, and even the ministers and the princes, the scholars, the rich and the poor, all would come to him in tens and thousands of people to just sit and listen to his words. Now, here's one thing. You could say he wasn't just a scholar in having this great influence, but he was also a scholar in tafsir, which is basically the hermeneutics in explaining Quran and explaining different things and analyzing history, analyzing fiqh. And same thing if we're talking about hadith, we're talking about mathematics, we're talking about astronomy, we're talking about medicine. He basically would go in each and every single science and would actually be one of the greatest within this science. And he was then one of the key scholars in Iraq at the time, not only in ilm, but he was also considered as one of the greatest, even when it came to bashfulness, even when it came to being a leader, and certainly that had attracted the many enemies out there to basically compete with him, and of course envy comes in. And one of the things that had affected basically his ability for oration is because you had many basically share and speak of different words of animosity towards him, and that basically had resulted in, of course, a lot of enemies that might actually start attacking him. Now, at the same time, one of the main reasons why that basically happened is because if you're going to be, let's say, ardent in the way that you may, or sometimes even articulate, ardent, articulate, or sometimes be direct in tearing down a lot of the misconceptions, or perhaps even pointing out a lot of what people were comfortable with and what people were probably embracing, and then you're pointing it and saying, well, this is wrong, this shouldn't be like this, and etc. And then many people, they'll basically be so patriotic about such ideologies or such paths or such cultures that they would take it personally. And then they would come in to start attacking you, and because you basically had attacked their lifestyle. And this happens a lot. Let's see. And certainly you had many people praise him, and he was this place that basically had this acceptance from a lot of scholars, and he was a place where all people had basically agreed that he was one of a kind because of the great depth of ilm that he had. And certainly you find one of those scholars is basically al-Imam al-Dhahabi. And let's see what he said. He said, quote, كان رأسا في التذكير بلا مدافعة، يقول النظم الرائق والنثر الفائق بديها، ويسهب ويعجب ويطرب ويطنب، لم يأت قبله ولا بعده مثله، فهو حامل لواء الوعظ والقيم بفنونه، مع الشكل الحسن والصوت الطيب والوقع في النفوس وحسن السيرة. وكان بحرا في التفسير، علامة في السير والتاريخ، موصوفا بحسن الحديث ومعرفة فنونه، فقيها عليما بالإجماع والاختلاف، جيد المشاركة في الطب، ذات فن وفهم وذكاء وحفظ واستحضار. You say that. Wow, let's look at that. He said he was on the top in reminding people. In other words, a motivational speaker with no one to compete with him. His words were beautifully eloquent. His words of in giving the orations, they were extremely intelligent, and he would speak in ease and speak in, of course, in fluent speech, and he would basically bring amusement to others, and he would let whoever is listening to him find that amusement and find delight in his words, and that no one matches him, not before and not after him. See, for he is basically the carrier of the banner for this motivational speeches, and he is also the one to be the master for the different skills for it, and he even had the beautiful voice and had basically the effect and the ability to affect people's hearts, and he had the beautiful history or the biography, and he was also a rich person in knowing the tafsir, or knowing the explanation for the Quran. He was a great scholar in the bibliographies. He was a great scholar in history, and he was also described as a person that had beautiful words and influential words, and certainly knew the sciences, how to make the best speeches. He was a scholar in fiqh. He was basically also a scholar that knew the differences of opinions between scholars on different matters. He was also a scholar of medicine, and he was a person of deep intelligence, great memory, and even memorized the evidences fast and didn't need to take the time to remember them. And of course, I'm not going to go over each and every single thing, but he did actually face a very dangerous predicament. Guess who it was coming from? His own son. His own son was an alcoholic. His own son was one of the worst people, to the point that the enemies, whether political enemies or whether religious enemies, or even different groups that wanted to take down Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi, they would use his own son, since his own son was basically, of course, capable of knowing all the different details. His own son, in order to buy alcohol, and in order to basically get closer to the enemies and have the money from them, he basically had sold many of his books. And remember, when we say many of his books, a number of his books, we're actually talking about there's no other copy than what he had written. There were no publishing companies. So it was the only company, it was the only book to be written. So his own son would actually sell his father's books, Abu al-Faraj al-Jawzi. He would sell his books and some other books that he had basically worked hard to have in his own library. He would also sell that in order to buy alcohol. No worse predicament than that. Imagine. Even when he had turned 80 years old, he was basically, there was a whole plot, even from those that were in the government, to isolate him completely from the public. So in other words, there was a curfew laid on him, and he was not allowed to basically deal with anybody. And even though his son was still alive, but of course, nothing was given to him. He got extremely sick, got extremely sick, an 80-year-old man, extremely sick, suffering from all of this that his son and his son had done. And subhanallah, later on, 5 years later, 5 years later, of course, another government figure basically comes in and uplifts the curfew, but then it was basically already too late. He dies months later. Just imagine, a lot of the work that he had written was actually sold by his drunken son. His son did not only carry his own sin of being drunk, but he carried the sin of basically keeping the ilm away from the masses that would have benefited from this ilm. Just imagine. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ya Rabbi, give us children that have taqwa, and children that would be qurrata a'yunin lana, and children that would be pious, and keep them and keep us away from fitna. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. I'm going to end right here, inshallah. And what we're going to be, I guess, mentioning some of the musannafat really quick, okay? Let's say some of the musannafat that he had written are actually translated into English, just like Talbis Iblis. Talbis Iblis is basically translated into English. And let's see what else. Maybe right there. I'm going to skip right there so it can have you. Let's see right there. Let's see where those books. Okay, and there a number of them were actually translated into English. Like I said, hold on. Maybe I'll give you. Let's see. All right, there we go. So it's more than 300 books. Okay. So let's see. كتاب المنتظم في التاريخ. That's a huge book. That's almost in 10 volumes. Beautiful book. I love it. I used to just enjoy reading in it. And تاريخ الرسل. Okay. Okay. الموضوعات basically that's in hadith. And oh, this is one of my favorites. صفة الصفوة في أخبار الصحابة والتابعين. One of my favorite books. This one's not translated for sure, but this one is. Sayd al-Khatir was also translated. This is one of those books that was Minhaj al-Qasidin. It is translated. It is basically a summary for Ihya Ulumuddin. That one was translated as well. So yeah, now you have some of them right there. All right. So inshallah, for those that I had promised I won't go basically for too long. Let's see. Should we continue? You know what? Hold on. What do we got right there? Yeah, it's best to stop right here. Okay, so what's the evidence that they used? Okay, so we're basically ending up right here. All right, because I promised that I won't take too long. And I could see people are coming in, so I'm just confused now. Okay. Should we, any questions about what we had said today? All right. So inshallah, we'll end right here. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Inshallah, we'll basically see you tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow, inshallah, for our tafsir as well. So stay tuned. There's a lot to say. So today, to summarize what we had said, we talked about Abu al-Fajr al-Faraj al-Jawzi. We also talked about this dua. Is it obligatory before Salah? Is it not obligatory? And what it means. And we went in details with certain words, labbaik wa sa'daik, and ash-sharru laysa ilayk, and what that means. So if there are any questions in regards to any of this, or even outside of today's topic, that's also okay as well. Go ahead, my friends. All right. So we'll end the live stream.